Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Artfluence Human Rights Festival panel. It's a really exciting discussion and unfortunately a very topical one that's always very topical for us today. We're going to be looking at artistic bodies and response to international war. We have a really interesting group of speakers, which I'm very privileged to be talking to today. And I think we need to consider this topic about bodies from quite a broad perspective. So we're lucky to have such a diverse panel. If we think about bodies as artistic bodies, we have represented here Panay Brikanda, an internationally award-winning Mozambican choreographer. When we think about bodies in terms of organizational bodies, we have represented Inge Koistemans, the General Director of the Festival Academy, an NGO that trains up-and-coming arts managers around the world. And if we think of bodies in terms of body politic or national bodies, we're privileged to have Justice Albie Sachs with us here, a veteran freedom fighter and ex-constitutional court judge. I'm Carla Lever. I'm a research fellow at the University of Cape Town, working on a Reimagining Tragedy in Africa and the Global South research project. That's just a fancy way of saying that I research ways that creative practice can engage with and sustain social change. So with that, we're going to start with Inge, because I know that she has to leave us a little early today. So I'd like to jump straight in and we'll get more narrow, but I'll start with a broad one, Inge. When you consider what art can give us, what tools we have as artists, as art festival managers in your case, often there's the critique that art is a very bourgeois way of engaging with something as urgent as war. Art and performance has a sort of slower temporality, whereas protest, for example, is urgent and immediate and responsive. Could you speak a little bit to what art can offer that might still be an incredibly valuable way of engaging?
I think when we are confronted with the urgency of war, what you often see is that there is an immediate response of artists. Because if people are occupied or violated, or if their freedom of expression is taken away, art is often a way for people to express themselves. So I think that's the first thing. It's also because when you're confronted with a crisis like that, you need to kind of make sense of things, and art is kind of a way to express that. But it's also about sharing what is going on with the world. So if you look at, for example, the Ukrainian crisis, there are many like filmmakers at this moment who say like, we can't take up guns, but our cameras can be very strong weapons, or we can stop tanks with books or things like that. So you have a whole crowd of people, music, who are using social media to share what is going on, to raise awareness about the conflict. So it's about that, but it's also about documenting what is happening. It's about history. It's about all these kind of things, archiving what is going on. And then I think festivals, especially in this kind of context, is about bringing people together. So in Ukraine, there's now an idea to organize a festival this summer in the subway, you know, because that's a place where people could be safe and could gather. So I think there's a huge need for people at these kind of moments to come together, to raise awareness about it, to encourage international solidarity also for what is going on in their context and in their lives. If that answers your question.
It is an absolutely excellent answer. Perhaps following up on that, as someone who is responsible for programming festivals and thinking about what would be appropriate, what programmatic responsibility do you think festival managers have in holding difficult stories? There's a fine line between representation and sort of war porn in many ways. So what do you feel the ethical considerations are for telling and holding these stories?
But I think I don't know if it's a programmatic responsibility, but what we see from festivals globally in the past years is that more and more festivals are occupied with their social responsibility, let's say. The way that we see festivals with the Festival Academy is as connected to the world. So it's not happening in an island. So you're connected to what is going on in the world. You don't exist in a vacuum. So we've seen many people taking up that role. And of course, it's a very sensitive line between, you know, are you making sensational stories out of it? Or is it really like the intimate story of somebody who has suffered? And I think what is important in that sense is who is telling that story? You know, from who does it come? Is it the victim? Is it the one that has been traumatized? Or is it somebody who is telling a story about somebody else? And if that is the case, you have to be very careful whether you are in the appropriate place to tell that story.
These are very, very important questions. But there's also the politics of access, isn't there? And I wonder if you could speak a little bit about some of the work you're doing in enabling stories to travel when bodies can't always. And I know that particularly from the Global South, we struggle with visas. In the pandemic. We've had disproportionate kinds of restrictions placed on us. So often I feel like when bodies move, people can be moved emotionally by stories, but sometimes who's telling stories and whose emotions are moved, the politics of that are very complicated. Perhaps you can speak to exciting ways we're trying to work with that.
Yeah, I think that's a very relevant question, and it's one that we've all been confronted with also during the past 2 years of COVID and not being able to move for many people. So I think with the Festival Academy, what we did, for example, during COVID is create this kind of pay what you can modality, because access is about resources, it's about spaces, but it's also about the stories you tell again. You know, who are you empowering to be present in a room, be it a conference or in a festival? Who are you empowering as an artist? So if you talk about access, that's also like the audiences you bring along depend also whether people feel represented by your festival in one way or another. So is it a festival where you only program a certain class or a certain color or whatever? That all depends on who you will reach, I think, through the festival. But I think online, because it is indeed about moving the body. It's about, I mean, there's nothing like in-person traveling. You know, the work that we do is all about meeting people, being in a space together, using your body, which communicates in so many ways. But I have to say that even through COVID, we have managed actually to create access for many more people coming from under-resourced spaces thanks to this online. And that's something that we are continuing in one way or another. And there are ways also to work with the body also in this online space. We've also been talking about embodied leadership and all these kind of things, which is different ways of looking at how you stand within this world today.
This might be a really lovely time to actually jump to Panaibra, because speaking about movement, I first encountered his work in a festival in Germany. Now, I live in a neighboring country to Mozambique, but I encountered Solo Familia in Germany. And I wonder your experience of exactly that, Panaibra, about how maybe your work can move easier than perhaps you can move, or has that not been your experience? How do you tell these stories, often of trauma, often of war, in a way that your body is also represented?
Hello, everyone. Well, I think, first of all, when I'm thinking about making work, there is many questions that I ask to myself. First, what I want to say, is it important for me? Is it relevant for whom? does it make sense to really engage on that and gathering people to share? So all these questions, I think after I get clear vision of the relevance of what I want to research or doing, so it's where I begin to really get more confidence. Because I think there are many stories that in a community level, in a family level, in a global level. So I think for me, most of my work, I really think a lot of the world where I'm living. So it's not, I'm just in a part of this global world and this global society. And that's why for me, I think my work, I think I try to push it more in a context that we can have a conversation to understand our world, how it functions, and then all these many different problems that we have now. I was interesting to hear about when my panel colleague, she was talking about the Ukrainian war, that they are making work in subway, all this. I think it's really very interesting because it's the way they find it to get on themselves to really share a story. But also for me, I think sometimes in those kind of contests can come some interesting experience that should be shared with other peoples, with other realities, which for me, I think in that context that I find it that my work gets more beyond just Mozambique or just my small community. Because if you just see even just the war in Ukraine, it's just this simple geopolitical issue that the Ukrainians are becoming a victim of that. But it's not only Ukrainian history. I think on my own work, when I look to my own body, so my own body is also was shaped by these different layers of geopolitical influence. So that first I was colonized, so then I have to adapt this system to exist. You know, we didn't bring the colonized, they come, but they begin to shape, you see. So, and the body should adapt and to voice itself, to stand, and then to continue to be alive. But we have this 16 civil war that we have in Mozambique, between Mozambicans. So it was not just because we hate each other, but was this political influence, because there are other group of people in power that were thinking that the best destiny for our countries to become a communist country. And there are other people who are backed by the capitalism that no, we have to be something else. So, but in all these political frictions, there is a body, there is a people. It's where we are. So we need to have awareness about this big geopolitical influence that it shaped our own existence. We never had the time to really think about what does it mean to be Mozambican, or what does it mean to be African. So we are just neighbor countries, but in a certain period of history, we were fighting against each other during the apartheid era, because there are some group of people that are thinking on segregation, there are others thinking different. So I think it's, I'm really disappointed that the world really engage itself in this big two elephants in the room, that they always have one side the capitalism, one side communism, but today it's more at the Asian influence or the Western influence to dominate the world. That is still, we are just under this pressure, and then we need to adapt and survive. So it's where I really see my working muscle is really deeply understand this new body that is emerging. It's emerging from the clash of these big elephants that we need to continue existing. So we need to adapt it. So the body is shaped, is transformed. When I'm talking about the body, I'm saying the psychological, all trauma that come from this. So, and then it's different layers that we can find in this process of adaptation. When we talk about the solo for Maria, for instance, it's a work that I'm just talking about woman, just one woman that she is in the world. But Maria can be any woman in the world. So the same process of struggle that she faced, other women face in different culture, on a different condition. It's not only women, but for me it was very interesting to talk about this solo for Maria. She's Maria. Maria, she is the mother of Jesus, where we praise. But this Maria that we have also has a struggle. There's a Maria that lost his child with Jesus that today as this figure that we know. But there is this Maria also, this little woman that was born in the neighborhoods somewhere in Mozambique, that she lost her legs because she was by accident a military vehicle that made the accident on her. But you can see it very light. But if you see what was going on was in a war period, that there was a fight between Renamo and Frelimo, which Frelimo was a communist defender, the Renamo, but democracy, what they say today, but backed by South Africans. And there was this child that was born in a neighborhood somewhere, which was a victim of this war. So for me, I'm really very interested on that, and those kind of stories that really could be brought, but also it's very intimate, that no matter where you are, the system still make any influence on you and still shape your body, the way you think, even your own conditions of living, as the example of Solo for Maria. And maybe we continue the story later, but I think, I hope I answered part of this question. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Panabra. And it was a very powerful piece. So I appreciated watching it and sharing that space. Of course, you make a very good point that there are all kinds of ways we can approach telling stories about all kinds of wars. You've chosen a very intimate way through one person's experience. You can have epics like Warhorse, which has become it was a big moment around the world. But do all war stories have to be stories of trauma? And I'd like to perhaps, before Inge has to go, ask her to reflect on the multiplicity of stories and emotions and experiences, ways of holding trauma that are not always about that trauma, but can be about the healing. Perhaps some examples she has experienced.
Well, I think maybe Rebecca, as I can just quickly say, that the healing process also is not, we have different strategy to enter to that process, which is not, it's to create, the creation itself as some kind of powerful moments where you can create the conditions of a dream that you can have this imaginary world. That's for me, it reminds one of the piece where I work, Marabenta solos, that after all this external situation of colonization, all this civil war, there is any place where we can remove all this and then have the body to begin to think about just body, bones, muscles, blood, breathing, thinking. Can we begin to teach this body to exist in that world? Can we make an imaginary story about what kind of journey this body can have or could? So for me, I think it's the process of healing also, as I think it's important to talk about the subject, but we need to always create a space to dream, to imagine, to, I think it's a kind of open, a kind of hope that, that together in this small space, which is a theater, that we can forget about the outside world, but be in that world and the dreams. And for me, I think that is really the much more interesting way. But for, of course, that is not only strategy, but I think it's important that we can talk about, but to create that space also, it's really very important. And for me, the process of healing, I think it's also, if you don't have any window that you can see what's in other places, so you just see this bombing or shelling of you, that's, I think it's make a much more big trauma. But if you beyond this, that at a certain moment, your hearing, you can hear other things. You can, from the shelling, you can hear it, something that maybe for the musicians can create something for sounds, and then you can create other spaces that I think it's very important for our continued healing, and also believe that there is a possibility beyond what we are living today.
Absolutely. Excellent, excellent response. Inga, do you have anything before you need to leave?
Yes, I'm really sorry about that, but I think that the aspect of healing is very important in all of this. You know, we've seen so much work at a certain time about the Lebanese civil war, for example, with so much humor also, but which was so important also for them to be able to kind of even years later to digest that kind of trauma and that kind of experience. But I think also what you mentioned, Panabra, is this idea of dreaming and imagination. There's this fantastic woman, Afghan street artist. She's now out of the country and she's safe, but she made a lot of work within the country where you can see clearly the trauma of being a woman within that country, but also the dream of, you know, being free and running through flowers and things like that. So I think that that's what it's about, like to create these spaces, and festivals often are these safe spaces where, you know, we can reflect critically, where we can imagine together and think about a world that is kind of different than the reality that we are living today, I think. But to keep on dreaming and hoping, and that's maybe then my last message for you today. It's been lovely meeting you all.
It was a beautiful last message. Thank you, Inga. I'm afraid we must lose you early, but I must turn now to the very patient Albie Sachs, who has been patiently waiting, and I have many questions for you, Albie. But I'd like to start with the idea, again, about ethics. when artists take on these stories that are holding not just perhaps their own trauma, but the trauma of others, other bodies, other stories, it comes down to that old story of rights and responsibilities. And we only have very broad guidelines in our constitution around what we can say. But what should we say from a fundamentally humanistic point of view as well? Albi, I think you might need to unmute yourself.
I've got many answers, and unfortunately, they don't correspond to your questions. But I think you will forgive me or find me not guilty at the end of my presentation. And to make it even worse, I was going to say, you're speaking about bodies. I'm going to put my body on the line, but I'm going to go one step further. I've never done this before. I'm going to put my body online with you guys. And it's a story also from Mozambique. And Mozambique at war, the war that was so vividly described, so vividly, and I was there. And I was infuriated by so much ignorance in the world about Africa and about Mozambique. And the world was presenting an image of hungry people, dictators in control, everybody fighting, killing other people, children with begging bowls. And what was so remarkable in Mozambique was how active the creative community was in the middle of war. The painters were painting, the musicians were composing, the dancers were dancing. And it wasn't professional performances for concert halls, for screens. It was people in the communities. So it was enormously participatory, very moving, very powerful, and very beautiful. And I decided, as a refugee received as a freedom fighter in Mozambique, and I would slightly rephrase the characterization of the war. Primarily, it was anti-apartheid for liberation of Africa on the one side, and South Africa hanging in there and using Renamo, whatever the Renamo people's motives were, to try and suppress our freedom struggle in South Africa. So I felt enormously buoyed up, in a sense, patriotic to the country that was receiving me, even though I brought danger to the country. And I got together with a filmmaker named Carlos Carvalho, and not Carlos, Sol Carvalho. And I also spoke to the artist Malangatana. And we conceived of a film in 3 parts. And it's called The Deeper Image. The image not of begging bowls and starving, helpless people, but the image of people who are creative, who find beauty inside themselves, even in the most desperate circumstances. And we divided the film into 3 parts. And the first part showed the carver Govani, the sculptor. We filmed him. He would go into the forest to find wood, but the forest was dangerous because Renamo was there. So there was war even in the trees. Sawing down the trees was dangerous. He brought this huge tree trunk into his studio outside Maputo. He started carving away. And he said, was actually quoting Michelangelo, the story is in the marble. He said, the story is in the wood. I've got this tree. I go to sleep, I would dream. I'll find the story inside. And the story he found was to show a man lying back. He's got a tiny little bit of strength, but he's almost dying. And the little strength he's got is to hold another body he's cradling. The little strength I have is to cradle the man who's dying. And it came out, it was so beautiful. And we following it all the way through. And then something happened. The arm of the tree trunk broke off and he didn't know what to do. So that's chapter 1 of the story. Chapter 2 the people in the bus company that traveled up and down the country had their own choral group. Every enterprise in Mozambique, you'll remember that, had its own enterprise. And they would sing and do a dance. It's called Makwayela. And Makwayela came from the mines in Johannesburg, brought into Mozambique. They all stand. It's all men, maybe one woman, and they dance in unison. Very, very beautiful. But the song that they're singing and dancing to was they're driving up to the north. They ambushed, and 5 of their conductors and drivers didn't come back. So it's vivid, powerful, but sad, and in unison. The third portion was Malingatana in his studio. He'd been imprisoned by the Portuguese. He painted, he invented, created his own style of representation. And he had paintings of war. And what war did, even in the struggle against Portuguese colonialism, the people rose up, but they are angry, they're fierce, they have teeth, they have metal. It was so vivid and so powerful, that images from war. So we're getting this all together in a film, and I'm blown up, and I lose my arm, and I recover. Mozambican doctors saved my life, and it's a South African bomb by South African security. I end up in London. We've now got the film ready for completion. It lacks narration. So we got a South African filmmaker in London to film me now with my short arm doing the narration about Africa presented as this country of helpless people needing succor and aid from outside. And it's about the creativity and the imaginations of people in the war. That is not killed. That is not, there's the other Africa that is protesting, that's singing, that's dancing, that's creating, depicting, that's alive, that's intelligent, that has sensibility and culture, very, 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 very rich. And I complete the film. And one of the issues we had to decide was what to do about the arm that was broken off. And is it permissible for a sculptor to put a little peg and put the arm back again? And meanwhile, I'm given a prosthesis, which I hated. Should I carry the prosthesis? So somehow the war and the filmmaking and the story all kind of became intertwined in a very, very rich way. But what I can say is making the film, interviewing Malingatana, the people from the bus company, being recorded, being noticed, Cavani the sculptor, having his work also recognized and going out to the world. All of that was very proactive, was very healing, was very affirming. And I think that's a very special role that art and culture can play. It's not simply recording the horrors and the tragedy of war, the executions, the destruction. It's not even just the little detail of the simple soldier having to survive in this world kind of terror and calumny. It's also the capacity, even the most dire circumstances, to express love, to express hope, tenderness, and human interconnection.
Albie, you are quite right. I pronounce you wholly not guilty. That was a far, far better response than what my question could have elicited. What a multi-part epic in all ways, from the epic to the personal and how they interweaved. And perhaps that links quite beautifully with some of Panaibra's experiences as well, because we're talking about how there's so much more than trauma. There is the healing in the creativity. There's the hope of being human, and being human is to make narrative, is to tell stories, is to understand our world in ways that are creative and not have our world happen to us. And perhaps that encapsulates it so beautifully. But Panaibra, can you perhaps add something, whether it's about the informal and formal arts sector, or whether it's about that healing personal journey of your own identity and storytelling in response to Albie?
Well, I think thank you first, Al, for sharing this beautiful story. And I know some of those artists in Malangana has passed away, and Saul the Carvalho also. It's very interesting and close to us. Still documenting, making a lot of interesting work in his Scala project. So, well, I think jumping to your, I don't know if I have a really comment, but maybe, yeah, I think the thing is that we born, we live, we die. So it's a journey. So, and for me, to exist in this journey is to be yourself, is to be true with yourself, and to exist as a community in the community is to share a self. And for me, what you, Albert say was really in that point, that no matter the circumstance where we are, that's my time. That's the time I have to live. That's the conditions, everything around myself is the circumstance, but I have no other option. I have to live in that precise moment, in that circumstance, and share itself, share myself, my thinking, my beliefs, my joy, my frustration. That's just a matter of circumstance and time. So when I work especially on a piece, time and space, Marabento solo, so it's just you are there in this particular time that you didn't choose by yourself, that I want to live maybe an era of the moon, if we succeed to colonize the moon. So you live your time, that's it, in a place that you didn't choose also, that I want to born in Mozambique because we'll have a civil war or this, blah, blah, blah. You don't choose. There is a time, there is a space, there is a body, there's a being be there. So what is much important is to exist. The only way to exist is to be yourself and continue to share that, being that I'm here, I'm exist, I'm Panibra, I'm Urban, no, I'm Carla. I think I see the world in that perspective. I can pick up the tree, as you say, sculpting in the middle of forest, that there is a tension that people are fighting, murdering themselves, but that's the way I have to express myself. That we have in, I think one of the points you talk about other traditions of healing. So we'll see that even for us, even if we're in a death situation that we lost someone very close, but we sing, we dance. That's the way we find to heal ourselves. So that's the body is gone, but we are still here. So we are here. We chant, we sing, and for me, that's a different way of really dealing with the trauma, different way of dealing with this therapy, that there is no one line, there is a kind of cultural background, of course, that influence, but the ultimate, it's yourself as a human being, the way you feel it, you think it, you feel it, and you express it. You'll find your own way to write the narratives. Yeah.
There's that cry, I am here, that is the human impulse throughout time, that we find the little scratch graffiti from, preserved in Mount Vesuvius. We find these impulses, these human impulses to speak to our state of being, but also to do our state of being justice. And perhaps this comes to you again, Albi, where I want to speak about the value of free things, how we value free things, particularly freedom of speech, freedom of action, freedom to protest, freedom of the press. Trevor Noah just gave a furious invocation at the Met Ball, saying to the free, land of the free, saying, what good are you using this freedom for, when there are artists and people in Russia and other places who cannot speak? So I would like to ask you whether you feel that, and I don't just want to make this about artists, I want to make it about anyone, because we all have creative impulses. Are we doing our freedoms justice?
Okay, now I'm going to remember Justice Albie Sachs sitting in the Constitutional Court wearing my gown and thinking about the freedoms you've mentioned. But if you look at the court, if you look at me, you'll see there are cowhide skins. You know the famous pictures you see of the Constitutional Court? uMngeni cowhide skins, black and white. You'll see the dappled carpets outside the court chamber, Marlene Dumas tapestries, Dumilifeni sculpture outside, court history. Not there accidentally. The idea of human expression goes together with legal rules and rationality. You don't separate the two. There isn't a mind up there that's all legal and thought, and a passion that's down there that's all unruly. Passion can be organized, can be streamed. The mind can be emotional and feeling. So the very physical framework, this beautiful building on Constitution Hill, which was the old Fort Prison to lock up people in struggle, in war, a site of pain, we now place this beautiful building not to demolish and destroy the old prisons and say they belong to the past, to say the pain is still there, the struggle is still there, we remember it, but we're not trapped in the past. We turn the swords of war into the plowshares of production. All of this is kind of, now we're sitting up as judges, but we get a request. I think it was the EFF, fairly newly formed then, wants to march from the City Hall to the Constitutional Court. There's some case that's on. And the local authority come to us and they say, what do we feel about it? Expecting us to say, no, we're a court, we're important people. Don't come and, you can protest as much as you like, but don't come and make a noise in our vicinity. And to their total astonishment and surprise, because they think, important people up there, the ruling elite, want to preserve space around themselves to shut out the noises of the world. We said, of course, our Constitution guarantees freedom of expression and peace, and the right to demonstrate is in the Constitution, the right to peaceful assembly. So we as a court now must be upholders of the right to assemble outside the court, but subject to one condition. The singing mustn't be so loud that we can't hear counsel addressing us and do our work as judges. And to their credit, the EFF were, I think, amazed and surprised that we said, okay, and their singing wasn't so loud, and we were able to go ahead with our proceedings. So I think through that sort of parable, I think I've responded to the question that you put to me.
Another vivid recollection, and I'm thoroughly enjoying these. I'm going to try and elicit one more in the time we have left, Albie. And that might be, you've sort of segued into legal performance, because of course the law is incredibly performative. And if we stretch and expand our idea and notion of performance, which is my job as a researcher, I look at protest. But if we start thinking of ways of holding space together as community and telling our stories, and thinking of that as also an important performance, we think in South Africa, I certainly think of our most profound moment as a country, a new country, with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was highly performative. There was a stage, it was filmed, there were exchanges, often reenactments, incredibly traumatic, of course, about war. But there was something fundamentally important about this ritual-like space that we held as a country. And I'm not sure, Panaibra, perhaps also something happened in Mozambique along that line. I would love you to tell me more. But Albie, do you think that there is a space, an important space we're missing in this new democracy for these ritual-like moments of storytelling and compassionate holding?
Yeah, it's so lovely, Carla, to hear you highlighting that aspect, that dimension of the TRC. It's the most important one. It's not the report. Very few people read the report, but everybody remembers. There's Matutu putting his head down and crying. Now, I cried as a judge once leaving the court, but I never cried when I was on the bench. Tears somehow excluded from legal proceedings. This was more than legal proceedings. This was the nation now, telling its stories and listening to its stories. We remember the tears, the lamentations. We remember Tony uMngeni going to the policeman who tortured him. Tell us, Sergeant Benzine, what's it like to put a wet bag over the head of somebody and they feel they're drowning? How can one human being do that to another human being? So I came up with to try and explain, why is it that the Truth Commission was so powerful, and the O.J. Simpson trial that was running at the same time, nobody knew what the hell's going on. So due process of law, and the jury's divided, the public are divided. The Truth Commission, much more open, much more expressive, and the truth came pouring out. And I offer this to yourself and the viewers for what it's worth. The 4 kinds of truth. There's what I call microscopic truth, evidential truth. You define an area, you measure variables, and you come to certain conclusions about the change. Most scientific truth is based on that kind of observation. And most legal truth is based on levels of proof in that way. Then there's logical truth, a truth implicit in a statement of proposition. And again, the story, for some reason, that pops into my head is when I handed over the manuscript of my book, Soft Vengeance of a Freedom Fighter, to the literary agent in New York to find a publisher. Before 5 minutes had passed, I knew a whole life story. And she ended up by saying, and let's face it, Albie, men are a fundamentally flawed species. So if that's true, I'm a man, I'm fundamentally flawed. It's not based on evidence. It's implicit in the logic. And legal proceedings are based on observational, evidential, and logical truths. But then there's experiential truths. Gandhi spoke about my experiments with truth. They weren't experiments in a laboratory. One stage, a very beautiful and moving passage in his book on his life in South Africa, was when he's with the colonial auxiliaries after the suppression of what was called the Bambata Rebellion, 1906, in then Natal. And the captive Zulus are being lashed, their bodies are bleeding. And he's a medical aide, and he goes with a sponge and warm water, and he washes the backs, and the colonial troops are jeering at him. But he comes away thinking, if the body can be a site of so much pain, I must give up pleasure through my body. And that's when he decided not to have sex anymore. He didn't consult his wife, one should note. But he didn't start as a Gandhian applying a philosophy to his life. He drew something from his life and developed that. And most of our decisions are based on experiential truth. And performance art has evidence, it has logic, but it's basically experiential. And the fourth kind of truth is dialogical truth. The interaction of all these different levels and kinds, the bombardment that's going on continually. And the strength of the Truth Commission was exactly the combination of all these elements of truth. It wasn't just a report based on evidence and testimony. It was very, very expressive. The only thing I would challenge in your very lovely and expressive mode of putting the question to me was that the TRC was our most performative and expressive. It's beaten by one other experience. The day we voted, 22 million people participating in that huge drama and in these long lines. And somebody, an old man, brought in a wheelbarrow. He's going to vote before he dies. That was maybe South Africa's greatest performative moment, a greatest emotional moment, and in a way, most beautiful moment. But the TRC was more manufactured, a deliberately created space. It was televised. It was caught on radio. We have a blue dress hanging in the Constitutional Court based on the testimony about the death of Phila Ndwandwe, who was executed by the security police and ANC competent, Mkonto were competent. And Judith Mason, the artist, hears the story of how when her body was reclaimed because the soldier who killed her came forward and had acknowledged what he'd done and got amnesty, the family recovered the body, they heard about her last moments, and she wanted to do something for her sister. And she went out and she bought some plastic bags, and she did, because Ndwandwe's body had only a bit of blue plastic covering her private parts. And she did this exquisite hanging with the paintings nearby in honor and tribute to my sister, she said, my sister Phila Ndwandwe, armed only, not the armor of God. All you had was a piece of rubbish and your dignity, and you covered yourself. What a housewifely thing it was to do. And Hamburgashli Mkonto. So here you have the story in a way through the blue dress, sacrifice, war, the artist, compassion, performance, all coming together.
The artistry of your stories, Albie, is that you bring all these threads perfectly and I have to do no work. So I thank you. But perhaps what I can reflect on as we come to a close, and I do need to be quite clear that I must run a tight ship. We have 5 minutes remaining, not just because it's good to run a tight ship, but because at 6 exactly I have load shedding. So if we run over, I will disappear. Panaibra, I'm going to ask you a last question, but I'm going to keep you to a 2-minute answer. And I'm sorry to be so strict. But this question is about aftermath. In my project at the University of Cape Town, we're really interested not in the tragic moment, the violence, the actual war, but in the subsiding. So in the post-apartheid space, in the post-colonial space, which I know you are very interested in, Panaibra. And what happens in that difficult, messy aftermath, how we create and bring together. Can I ask for a final 2 minutes, and I'm so sorry to restrict you to them, of your thoughts on what we do now?
Well, I think before I go to your answer, I think it was something about the truth that we have been talking, I know 2 minutes too, that was talking about the truth. And for me, I think also was interesting, but maybe in another time, to know about the fabricated truth. That is also about the propaganda, that we fabricate a kind of truth. And suddenly everybody will believe in that propaganda, and then that's the truth. So, but anyway, that's not the question, but I was interested to go more for him in a legal perspective and other way to really dig more in that, because I'm very interested also about that, about the truth for us as a human being, and then what to believe, and all the story are human written, and then who to believe, which Bible am I believe. So that's another truth. But anyway, going back to your questions, as we have 2 minutes, maybe now what. For me, I think the very interesting point of a post everything is here we are, and then to accept that everything's happened. So we are here in the Fox, and how we reconstruct without ignoring what happens. So we become influenced about all these things, and then try to catch on all this mess or on this kind of influence, and try to catch the beautiful on that. That if that doesn't or happens, as we say, and it's set in very different perspective, that to exist, there was a kind of sometimes accidental meeting between men and women, and existed a new being. So, and for me, I think is that we have all this chaotic, whatever beauty on that, but how to overcome, to bring from this pause to something beautiful. And maybe I will stop here as we are running out of time.
I'm sorry to cut you short. I have 1 minute till I myself am cut short, but what a beautiful way to end. Before I am cut off, I would like to thank this wonderful panel, and particularly Ingo, who is not with us, Albi, Panaibra, for your generous thoughts and your illuminating insights. If I have a moment to end us thinking about aftermath, I'd like to quote a little bit from Sipokazi Jonas's poem that she opened Sono with in 2021, What Does Not Sink. It's a short extract. But what of the after, she says, when the depth of this moment is absorbed by history? Who will we be? We are a people who know how to build out of the remnants of disaster, and we will do it again and again. When we salvage what is useful, may we find ourselves baptized into something new, new ways of mourning, a people who have learned to breathe underwater, reciting the names of those we have lost, and memories that never sink. And on those beautiful words by Sipokazi, I will bring us to a close. I thank you all for your generous insights, and please tune into the next Artfluence panel sometime soon. Take care.
Thank you. Bye. Yeah.
I don't know if you can hear me. We've had load shedding right now.
Albi, we must be on the same schedule.
Think moments and memories. Make magic and movies. Shared between sons and daughters, or just friends in their quarter. More music, more movement, more space for amusement, where history was made and the future is paved. Adventure awaits. Together, embraced, just down the highway. Think Midlands, my way.